I love technology. Most of us love technology, but we have become slaves of technology. We are, in fact, today, the tools for technology and technology companies, whereas we should be using technology as tools for ourselves to better our lives. You might have heard of the concept of digital detoxing. Sounds cool. The likes of the rich and powerful, such as Simon Cowell, have gone out into the media and spoken about how nice it is to not to use his email or have any social media presence. That sounds absolutely wonderful to me. I, too, wish I had a secretary that did my emails and kept up my social media presence. But unlike Simon Cowell and people who are very wealthy and have the luxury to do so, I, alongside everybody else, am stuck with using the technology that we have available today. But what if we had reliable ways of designing technology so to ensure that it's benefiting mental health rather than creating the problems that we see today? So what do I mean by good mental health? There are lots of different definitions, and not everyone agrees. There's no clear-cut definition of good mental health. But there are some aspects that experts do agree should be there for us to be able to discuss mental health. So it's not simply the absence of mental health problems, but it's certainly correlated with the absence of mental health problems. But good mental health is basically characterized by a person's ability to fulfill some key functions and activities in life. So, for example, the ability to learn, or the ability to feel and express a range of both positive and negative emotions, the ability to maintain healthy social relationships with other people, or the ability to cope with change and uncertainty. All of these are very important for good mental health. So what if we designed every single product, technology, or service with good mental health in mind? So I'm a psychologist, and I'm focusing on development anxiety across the lifespan and other types of psychopathology and how they develop for different people at different stages. And I run a lab called Design Psychology. And if that name sounds strange to you, and you're wondering what on earth is design psychology, I made it up. It doesn't exist. Basically, I'm attempting to start a whole new branch of psychology that deals with exactly these processes. So some of my work touches upon human-technology interaction, for example, human responses to robotic systems or to drones. I'm interested in what types of behavioral characteristics are conducive to using technology in a good way compared to who fails to use technology in a good way. I have my students run anxiety-inducing workshops where we attempt to design products or services that induce anxiety so as to understand what not to do when we're doing it for real. So my vision for the Design Psychology Lab is to create a framework that's going to be widely available for companies, designers, CEOs, people, everybody, that will help us to design products and technologies with mental health in mind and create better outcomes for people. Now, internet today is a place, as we all know, where harassment and bullying is continuously perpetuated and manufactured on a second-to-second basis. And the problem that we see today with all digital technology is that it's not there by accident. It's there by design. People have largely known some of the effects that these technologies would have on our mental health, but they've chosen to ignore them for different reasons. You might have heard the motto, move fast and break things. It's a Silicon Valley motto. It sounds really cool and inspiring, and I love that motto, except when we apply it to human beings. Suddenly, it clings very bad. And alongside all of this, we're seeing massive increases in anxiety levels across the globe today, not just in the Western world, everywhere. And the cost to the UK economy have been constantly shifting with larger and larger predictions of how much is going to cost our society to deal with the effects and anxiety-related outcomes. Now, you'll often hear people say, well, it's not the technology that is to blame. It's the people that use the technology that are to blame. And there's, of course, a small grain of salt of truth in there, because it does depend on who you are when you use tech. But I'm going to quote Eddie Izzard, the comedian here. He said, "They say that guns don't kill people, but I think the guns help. Just standing there saying bang doesn't really hurt anyone." Or just standing there, sending out a vicious tweet to someone doesn't hurt anyone if that tweet never, in fact, arrives to the intended victim. So the assumption here, when people say that we should make choices, we shouldn't let this technology affect us, is that we assume that people are rational actors. And decades of research in psychology, behavioral neuroscience, behavioral economics show that we are quite the opposite. In fact, the 2002 Nobel Prize in Behavioral Economics to Daniel Kahneman and Vernon Smith was showing exactly this, that in conditions of uncertainty, human beings make terrible decisions. We are really bad for making decisions that are good for ourselves. We also know from recent work that human beings did not, in fact, evolve. Our brains didn't even necessarily evolve to be rational in the first place, and we certainly see this among young people. So according to the former president of Facebook, Sean Parker, they built in tiny little dopamine hits to our brains into the system by design. So they realized that when somebody presses like for something that I say, that makes people feel very good. And if I don't get many likes, I start to feel bad. This is called a social validation feedback loop. And this loop exploits a commonly known vulnerability in human psychology. Now, this is a quote by Sean Parker himself. God only knows what it's doing to our children's brains. We have people like Chamath Palihapitiya, who's the former president of user growth at Facebook, saying, I don't touch this stuff anymore. I don't use this technology anymore. It's terrible. A recent study called ABCD, which is Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, it collects data on more than 10,000 adolescents. It was recently featured on CBS 60 Minutes in December 2018, and you can check it out if you're interested. They have preliminary findings showing that screen time in adolescence is related to the thinning of the brain cortex. So basically, all of us are part of the largest social experiment ever conducted on Earth, but we're not allowed to touch the data or to analyze it or to see what it does. We know from psychology that there are huge differences in who you are, your behavioral characteristics, in terms of the effects that technology might have on you. For example, people who are socially anxious or shy, they show higher levels of physiological responses when they interact with virtual humans. They get engaged with their whole body. People who are non-shy, non-socially anxious, they don't as much at all. So we should have to think about behavioral characteristics. We'll also have to think about age and development. People who are young versus people who are older, there'll be different effects of technology. But of course, it's very difficult to design tech or services that are going to be used by everyone, right? So we have to think about these things all the time. And we have to think about how will people use it and what impact will it have on their mental health. There are over 10,000 mental health apps available today, according to a recent review. These are often labeled as well-being apps or sort of therapeutic tools. The vast majority of those are not evidence-based. Only, I think, about 23 were informed by evidence, which basically means someone read something about therapy and they included something about it. So it's not been tested whatsoever. American Psychiatric Association recently identified case studies where some of these apps have actually been harmful. So for example, an app downloaded by people to help them with bipolar disorder, what used to be called manic depression, was shown to be given advice for people to drink alcohol during their manic phases, something that we know is directly harmful. Most of them are probably ineffective, so they do nothing, but because people stop using them, they notice that they don't have any effect. And we don't know where the data goes. The data is sometimes resold to third parties by these companies. So worst case scenario, these apps make no difference. They're ineffective. And, well, no, sorry, that's best case scenario. Worst case scenario is somebody dies from using these apps. And currently, there is no regulation put in place as to who can provide a commercially available mental health app. Many of you might have seen WallE, which is a fantastic Pixar dystopian cartoon film about the future of humankind. Basically, this is what they were predicting. Human beings are based in these large cushioned chairs, and we're unable to move anymore because we can't use our limbs. We communicate even though we're sitting next to each other, we're communicating via screens, and we're all just basically drinking a liquid diet. It sounds very funny, but considering where we're heading at the moment in terms of tech use, I don't really think this is far away at all. I actually think this is quite a profound dystopian vision of what might happen to humanity unless we start caring about mental health outcomes. We don't have the luxury of ignoring mental health when we design. And I believe we're all designers, regardless of what we do, whether we're researchers or we are in companies or we work with anything that's going to be used by people. We are involved in design. So it's our responsibility to think about mental health. So I don't want to leave us with this. This is horrible. I hope we don't end up here. I want us to talk about what could happen if we actually start caring and implementing some of these design psychology principles that I've mentioned. So, for example, 5 years from now, if we reverse the development, mental health will no longer be a sexy bandwagon for people. It's actually going to be taken seriously and normalized. People will hire designers who have this type of design psychology background. Mental health apps will be based on empirical data. They will be tested and tried, and this data will be available for other people to replicate it and to check, is this good? There will be a framework in design psychology available for anyone who wants to implement these types of principles into their work. And, for example, anything that's going to be done is going to use this framework to test it first before putting it out there. This is my PhD student, Ian. He's currently working on developing virtual reality exposure therapy for people who stutter, to help them with stuttering and to help their social anxiety. And he wants to do this in a way that's going to be tried and tested for effects, and then that this will be a cheap technology that they can use at home to help themselves. So this is how things will be done 5 years from now. 10 years from now, it's going to be unthinkable that we're not thinking about mental health anymore. It's going to be a thing of the past. And the reason why many of us in this room who are born in the 80s never got ill from technology such as this is because we had our dads come into our room and wave their finger and show the phone bill and say, "You're not allowed to spend this much time on the phone, young lady." Right? So everything should become a service, because once we start paying for things, a different type of care will be put into the design and the outcomes, and as service users, we'll have a bigger say in what is done to us. Social networks should be services. Internet search should be a service that we pay for 10 years from now. And information will be truly free because we're not paying for it by our data that's used against us in one way or another. And 20 years from now, we can finally say that we're no longer the tools of technology, that we now use technology as tools to better our lives. And we probably won't have smartphones at this point, but we'll have many new creative ways to communicate with one another. And design psychology is going to be absolutely common and normal, and there'll be firm regulation to prevent anything bad happening to our data. And the countries that struggled with the internet service model 20 years from now hopefully will have caught up because of raising standards around the globe, and also people wanting better privacy regulations. So this is where we could get to if we start making changes. I just want to leave you with a final take-home message. This is one of my favorite quotes. It's by a designer called Victor Papanek, who wrote a wonderful book on design. And he said, "You are responsible for what you put into the world, and you are responsible for the effects that those things have upon the world." Now, when people finish their medical training, they all take the Hippocratic Oath, which I won't reiterate for you, it's unnecessary. But the Hippocratic Oath contains the words, "do no harm." And I really want us to work together to create a code of conduct where we design technology that's going to do no harm to either the body or to the mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Nejra. So it looks like we have quite a few questions up already. So right there at the top, what positive intervention should we build into our day-to-day to combat negative aspects of technology?
Right, so this depends on who you are. If you are a parent and you're worried about your child spending all their time on the screens, please take their screens away. There's nothing wrong in doing that. In fact, the World Health Organization now says that children up to 2 years should not be exposed to screens whatsoever. The UK hasn't caught up yet with this legislation or recommendations, but I think this should be legislated. So take it away from kids. Kids need fresh air, common sense. If you are an adult and you're forced to spend a lot of time in front of tech like myself, so you might be working with a computer screen, be mindful of your habits and things that you do, and because we very often get into these hamster wheels of constantly checking email, constantly checking social media, whatever. Just be mindful. Maybe start tracking yourself and see what you do, because you'd be surprised at what you do. The documentary that I mentioned about the CBS 60 Minutes ones, they actually followed up the parents of some of these kids, and they showed some horrendous fact about 40 days a year being spent on screens by adults. Okay, do you want to spend 40 days of your life every year doing this? So this is where we have to start becoming mindful ourselves. Unfortunately, the technology is designed in a way that's going to keep us going, is going to keep us scrolling, and this is what I'm trying to change with my work.
That actually brings us very nicely onto the next question, which is about this kind of tension between, is it the fault of the technology itself or the social media companies, the app designers?
Yeah, I think it's really both. It's everyone's fault, basically, right? So it's exploiting vulnerability in human psychology, but it's also designed to do that. And then, of course, we are just sheep, the majority of us, and we go, yes, we love it, and we buy phones, and we really love stuff like that. So I think all of us, the designers, the companies, and the people, have to start becoming more resilient towards what this tech does. But I believe we can design these processes in ways that stop these continuous dopamine hits. This is something we need to do more work on. But yeah, I think digital detoxing can be done over a weekend, but for most people, it's not really realistic, right? Again, I wish I had a secretary that did all this stuff for me and I can just do important work, but we can't do that.
The next question is actually about detoxing, so the perfect lead-in. Instead of trying to detox over a weekend, is there a way that we can avoid things that are toxic in the first place?
Well, yeah, if we could turn back time, right? No, I think that's impossible. I think we are living in an increasingly digitized age. I think turning back the clock and becoming Luddites and living on top of a hill in a cottage with a goat is, it's not going to happen. This is something we can do for ourselves. We can rent a cottage and have a little goat next to it like once a year if we can to take a vacation, but most of us are forced to deal with technology. So avoiding tech, I think, is also not very good. And I think when people hit adolescence especially, this is when, you know, there's this continuous debate about, should we give them phones? Let's take their phones away. I think that can be dangerous too, because we need to provide people with autonomy to be able to use these systems, but also leave them when they feel that they need to. And this is something we all need to teach ourselves to do.
Mm-hmm. So the next question is a really nice open-ended one about your vision for the future. What would a design psychology framework look like, and how might that be implemented by people?
Right, I'm working on it, okay. I want to basically provide a framework for anything that you're designing. How could you test and implement sort of the effects that it has on people's well-being or mental health? And so that will require, there will be some easy principles, I hope, that companies can sort of abide by themselves. But it will require working with behavioral scientists of all shapes and sizes to test some of these things. So my hope is that people will be able to come to me, to the Design Psych Lab, and say, I have this product in mind, we're attempting to prototype it. We want to know what the mental health outcomes are. Can you help us? Where I will go, yes, of course, for a fee. But, you know, I'm joking. But basically, that's my vision, is that we can provide this service, because not everyone is a behavioral scientist or a psychologist or whatever. But the larger framework is something that I'm working on. It's going to include aspects of design ethics. So thinking about, you know, what should we be doing from a moral standpoint? Should we be creating addictive technologies in the first place? I mean, a great example of that is we know that it's terrible for very young people to spend too much time on their screens. And despite of dire warnings by a large scientific community, Facebook decides to go ahead anyway and launch a messenger app for children, right? So there is, you know, the ethics are out the window at that point. This is where I think design psychology can kick in, where we go, there is actual empirical evidence that shows that communicating this way impairs young people's ability to interact socially in face-to-face situations. So I'm working on it, I'm getting there. Give me 5 years.
And it seems like the audience are curious to know what kind of apps they could or should be using. So it seems like the first question is Headspace okay?
Oh, right, yeah. This was discussed during a recent conference I attended. So there was somebody that did a mock-up of Headspace where they took out the meditation component of Headspace, but basically made an app that looks exactly like Headspace, and they let people use it. And they compared the two groups of regular Headspace users and the fake Headspace users, and both groups reported having a great effect. So it's kind of clear that it's not necessarily that the mindfulness component actually works, and Headspace, in fact, is not, it claims to be, but it's not. It's informed by empirical findings, but it's not actually a rigorously evaluated process. If you think every app that tells you something that you need to do, that, in my world, is considered a behavioral intervention. Now, for me to run a behavioral intervention with people where I go, I'm going to tell you to do something, you're going to do it, it's going to change your behavior, it's going to have effects on you. I need to, A, apply for very rigorous ethics, B, show that it's not going to be harmful, C, test it over and over again, and then go, yes, what I ask you to do does have an effect. As far as I know, none of these apps have done this. Okay, so that's the sad truth.
Are there any that you could recommend, or examples of good practice that people might use?
Yes, try mindfulness in a class. Go to an actual course. Don't use your phone for this. Also, please, Pokemon, stop gamifying sleep. I don't know if you guys seen this. Pokemon not wants to make us sleep better by having us play games with sleep. Something for you, Mark. I don't know if you've heard about it. I would say, these things can be useful tools if it's something that you're already doing, but any many mindfulness teachers will tell you that you actually have to, if we're using mindfulness as an example, you actually have to learn it and do it in everyday life. And receiving notifications of it's time to do your mindfulness, it kind of goes against the entire principle of mindfulness, right? Yeah.
So this might be the last one we have time for. Aside from social media, what might be the most detrimental technologies to our mental health today?
Ooh, well, this is a very tricky one. This is one I've thought about a lot. I'm working on editing a volume where academics that have done a lot of work on social engagement online in adolescents provide both positive and negative empirical evidence for how some of this tech affects the way the young people interact today. And I'm sad to say, I think social media does top that list. I would say just screen time per se is a bad thing, regardless of what you do. So spending way too much time doing that instead of interacting with your environment is probably a bad thing. But it doesn't have to be. I think the effects of social media are wide and far-reaching because of all the hurt that it can cause to people. I'm sure you guys have heard about the recent stuff about Instagram, where a young person committed suicide having watched self-harm pictures, and Instagram refused to remove the content from the page. So, there's some really evil stuff happening at these social networks, which I think probably top the list for me. But I'm hoping that once we start moving into the realm of paid services, paid social networks, that this might come to change.
Wonderful. That's all we've got time for. Thank you so much, Nejra.
Thank you.